Hi, and welcome to the AWS Tech Talk on best practices for capacity management on AWS Outposts. I'm Jennifer Lynn, Senior Product Manager for AWS Outposts, and I also have with me today Chris Lunsford. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, as Jennifer said, I am Chris Lunsford. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect with AWS Outposts and look forward to diving in to capacity management with you today.
Cool. Our agenda for today includes a quick overview of what outposts are, a little bit about how to plan for the capacity you'll need on an outpost, and then the real meat of this talk is in the demos. We have demos on monitoring, sharing, and managing your outpost capacity. So let's dive in. First, we'll talk about what outposts are. Why did we build it? Why are customers excited about it? If you've been watching this hybrid space for the past decade or so, you know that the goal here is to have presence on premises and in the cloud with as consistent an experience as possible. And it's been a real struggle for products to deliver on that goal. And the challenges start from the hardware and then proliferate all the way up the stack. So when we set out to create Outposts, we took a different approach. We started with the same Nitro-based hardware that we run in our AWS regions. And that includes everything that AWS has learned from 15 years of operating at the security and scale of our cloud. And then we created a fully managed service around that. And it turns out the reason people want that consistency is that the most expensive thing here is training your people twice. And so that's why the same is so important to us. Because it's a managed service, we're handling all of the heavy lifting of maintenance and patching, and you get all the newest AWS features automatically. As long as it makes sense in an outpost context, you get those features on your outpost without having to upgrade or patch. And Outposts is a, like I said, fully managed service that offers the same AWS infrastructure services. That includes EC2, EBS, S3, EKS, RDS, the list goes on. And you use the same APIs to access all of those services and tools. And those same tools include things like CloudFormation, CloudWatch, etc. We can deliver and install that in virtually any data center, colo space, or on-prem facility that you choose. So why would you want to do all of that? A couple of reasons here. The very first customers for Outposts are really interested in low latency. And we have customers with applications that just can't move to an AWS region. They need to remain close to a mainframe or manufacturing systems. But we really quickly found that there was also interest from a variety of other use cases. And we fully expect with the breadth of customers that are talking to us that this is not yet a complete list. But some of those other use cases are local data processing. So this is when you're dealing with a workload that just has tons of data. So think IoT, connected car, factory. And in these situations, it's really difficult sometimes, whether that's a latency impact or a financial impact, to get that data in the right place, to use the tools that you want to do the analysis and make a decision. And Outpost brings the ability to act on that data really close to the source. And speaking of keeping data in the right place, we're seeing a lot of customers with interest in data residency. Usually regulations are the driver here, and whether that's a government keeping PII within borders or an industrial driver like healthcare data or gambling regulations. Sometimes being able to take a little piece of the cloud with you wherever you need to be, it can be really valuable to establishing your business presence. And then finally, we're also seeing customers use Outposts as a stepping stone before they fully modernize and move to an AWS region. And it makes this migration work locally available so they can keep re-architecting and reiterating while keeping it close to their ERP or mainframe and not being impacted by latency during that transition period. Once they're done, you can lift and shift to the region. And we've also seen this in places in the world where we've announced that an AWS region is coming soon. And customers can usually get an Outpost set up in a qualified location in around 2 to 8 weeks. And so because it is a truly consistent platform, it allows those customers to get started now and be ready, again, to lift and shift when that AWS region is live. So today we're looking at capacity. So Chris, can you tell us a little bit about getting started and planning for the capacity customers will need?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Jennifer's mentioned, Outposts provide a local pool of compute, storage, and networking capacity so that you can run select AWS services in your on-premises facility. And as you go to order an Outpost, you're going to need to provide some information so that we know how much or how to size that pool of compute and networking and storage capacity. And when we deliver it, it delivers in one or more Outpost racks. And we often refer to a given Outpost deployment as just an outpost or as a logical outpost. And so on the screen here, I've got a logical outpost with 3 racks. And one of the benefits and major benefits that delivers on those use cases that Jennifer talked about, it is that you know where your resources are running. When they're running on Outpost, if we look at this deployment here with 3 racks, when you're running an EC2 instance, an RDS database, EKS worker nodes, you know that they are running within those racks sitting within your facility. And so that gives you that local low latency connectivity between your on-premises environment and the resources running on the Outpost. That also gives you the data residency. You know where your data lives. It lives in one of those racks, and gives you the local data processing. And so this is how we deliver those services on premises, by bringing a piece of the cloud, as you said, to your location, with using the same AWS hardware and services that we use in the region, just deployed within your facilities. So as you go to request or order an Outpost, you're going to need to provide some information to let us know how big of a pool you need. And these have a specific, or finite, I should say, amount of capacity within these Outpost racks. So there's going to be a certain number of compute hosts and a certain number of storage hosts. And to help us determine what configuration you need for your Outpost, we size Outposts along 3 dimensions. So the compute that you need, the EBS block storage that you're going to need, and the S3 on Outpost object storage that you'll need. And so the storage sizing particularly is pretty easy. In general, we ask you for 2 figures. We ask you how much EBS block storage do you need, typically expressed in terabytes. We'll ask you how much S3 on Outpost storage do you need for that object storage, again, in terabytes. So easy enough to ask. Some things that you will want to consider when providing those numbers back to us, and of course we work with you as we build these configurations, but some of the things you want to consider, for your EBS storage, you want to factor in, hey, here's how much storage I need for all of my instance root volumes, for my additional attached volumes, if you've got databases, et cetera, that have secondary volumes. So the same things that you would total up in region and think about when you're running EC2 instances or RDS instances, EKS, et cetera. You want to total those up and determine how much block storage you need to support those instances. For S3 on Outposts, the same type of sizing as what you do in region applies. You'll need to think about the buckets that you want to create, your applications that are going to both store and retrieve data from those buckets, and how much capacity you're going to need for those application workloads. But you'll also need to factor in some things that perhaps you don't think about in the region. So in the region, when you take snapshots, for example, of EBS volumes, those store on S3 in the region. Well, if you want to take local snapshots in Outpost, and of course you can take snapshots and send them to the region, but if you want a faster snapshotting process to store your snapshots locally on Outpost, you can do that using S3 on Outpost storage, but you'll need to take that into consideration. So you'll need to think, hey, if I want to take snapshots of these volumes with this frequency and keep them for this long, you'll also want to factor that into your S3 on Outpost storage requirements. Like I said, sizing storage is relatively easy. We get a bulk measure of how much block and object storage you need, and that's usually pretty straightforward. Now, sizing compute gets a little more interesting. We often, it's actually easy enough to provide, but it takes a little bit to think about, is we'll ask you, how many of which EC2 instances do you need to run? And so I'll double click and explain on that just a little bit. So when you're deciding which instances you need to be able to run and how many you need to run, these are the same EC2 instances that are available in region. We have select instance families available on Outpost. You can see on our slide here that we support C5, C5D, M5, M5D, R5, R5D, I3EN, and G4DN instance families. And so not all of the families that are supported in region, but this certainly gives you, good coverage of the instance families that you might need to deploy in your Outpost, because you've got compute optimized, general purpose, memory optimized, and even accelerated instances that you can use on your Outpost. And so when it comes to sizing your compute, we tell you to start with your instance families. Is which of these families do you need for your workloads? Could be one, maybe just a pool of general purpose compute may be fine for your use cases. Maybe you need some of those accelerated instances or some compute optimized instances, memory instances, etc. And so we start with the families that you need, and then we determine what sizes that you need. And we build an Outpost configuration to meet your requirements for the instances that you need to be able to run. Now, if you go to the Outpost pricing page, and we've got a screenshot of that in the lower left-hand portion of this slide. If you go to the pricing page, you'll see some standard configurations for some Outposts. Like the first one on that list says, hey, this is a general purpose small unit for workloads such as retail point of sale or enterprise applications. And you see that configuration to the right. And the configuration says that this small unit can run a total of 2 M5 24 extra large instances. And you might say, that's great, but I don't use 24 extra large instances. I need something smaller. I need some 4 extra larges or 2 extra larges or 8 extra larges, whatever it may be. And visually depicting that, what we're telling you when we have these configurations saying, hey, we give you the capacity to run a total of 2 M5 24 extra larges, is we're telling you the maximum compute capacity on that Outpost. And so you could run 2 of these 24 extra larges. If you don't need those, it can of course be subdivided into the slots and sizes that you need. And so with those sizes, like I said, we get the information from you to say, this is what I need to run. I need to run these families, these sizes. We get that list from you. If it happens to fit one of the standard configurations that you see on the Outpost pricing page, that's great. You can just go and order one of those through the AWS console. If it doesn't, if you need something a little different, maybe you need a little less or a little more of a given instance family or quantity of sizes, we can actually build custom configurations too. And that's pretty common. So if the standard configs work, we'll use those. If you need custom, then we'll certainly create those for you. And then the last things, so in addition to considering the workloads that you need to be able to run today, so the families and sizes you need to run today, we're also going to ask you to consider future growth. While you can expand Outposts, you can both scale them up and scale them out. And by scale up, what we mean is if you've got those 3 Outpost racks, if there's extra space and power available within those racks, you can add additional compute hosts to it later on. So you can scale up and add additional capacity to your existing racks if there's room to do so. And if there's not room, you can also scale out. So we can add additional racks, up to 96 racks in a logical Outpost. And so the nice thing about that is you can scale up when you need it, but it does take a little bit of time. And that can be like 2 to 8 weeks, to provision and get the new capacity delivered, installed, and activated, et cetera. So we tell you to plan for that future growth. It's probably not something that you want to do, every month. So if you're going to plan for the next quarter or for the next 12 months, consider, what additional instances above and beyond what you plan to run initially when you're sizing your Outpost configuration. We also recommend that you add spare capacity to provide for N+M redundancy. And what we mean by that is to say, if your applications really do need, let's say 24 extra large worth of EC2 instance space, that's great. Then if you ordered this small unit and you only really need one of these to carry your application workloads, then you have redundancy. That means there's twice the amount of capacity that you need. And so if something happens to one of those hosts that's running your running instances, it means your instances can be restarted or can resume on the surviving capacity that's still there. As Werner Vogels likes to say, says everything fails all the time. And so we encourage you to plan for failures. And sometimes that can be actual failure of a compute host. And so we encourage you to have the extra capacity. So when a host fails, it is a managed service, we'll come out and replace it. We want to make sure that while we're replacing it, and that takes usually about a couple of days, while we're replacing the failed server, you still have all the capacity you need to run your workloads. It's also beneficial because from time to time, we need to do maintenance events to be able to update the hosts. Now we have designed them so that most updates and most operations don't require a reboot and don't cause disruption to your running instances. But occasionally there are maintenance events where we're going to say, hey, we need to cycle a host. And when we do that, we will also want to make sure that while that's rebooting, while it's coming back up and getting its updates, again, that your applications continue to run on the other available hosts. So it's pretty
Chris,
easy.
that would be a great opportunity to plug that white paper that just came out.
Oh, yes. So recently published, I authored a high availability white paper myself, and Rohan Matthews authored a high availability white paper for Outposts that covers all the mechanisms available to help you build a highly available Outpost deployment. and to cover those mechanisms that we're talking about, making sure that that redundancy is included in your design and that you've got the mechanisms in place so that when hosts go down, your instances gracefully recover on those surviving instances. So absolutely, if you want to check that out, we've got the URL here on the bottom for the pricing page, and you can actually find the white paper. If instead of going to outpost/pricing, if you go to outpost/resources, you'll actually see the high availability white paper underneath the resources page on Outposts. All right. So now that you either already have an Outpost, if you're a customer that's already got an Outpost in your environment, that's fantastic. Or if not, now that you're placing an order for an Outpost, there are some best practices that we would recommend to you as you prepare to order and then to start using your Outpost capacity. For starters, we recommend using AWS organizations. Now, you certainly could have a single AWS account. You could log into that account, go into the console, order your Outpost, and deploy all of your workloads using a single AWS account. You could do that. But as a best practice, we recommend using AWS organizations. And the separation between accounts provides a number of benefits, like limiting the blast radius if somebody goes in and runs some automation script within one account, perhaps in test or dev. So that it doesn't impact, for example, your production workloads. And in general, we use the same best practices that are recommended by AWS for using AWS organizations. And so I'm actually showing here one of our recommended kind of org structures if you're using AWS organizations to manage your Outpost capacity. The first of which is to say, just like you have perhaps a shared network prod account, that you use that prod account to deploy your shared networking resources in the AWS cloud, you may want to consider creating an Outpost prod account, again, under your infrastructure OU, where you can order your Outposts. And so whether you're going to have one Outpost or you're going to have several, you would use that Outpost prod account to order the Outposts, and it would really be the owner or manager of all of the Outpost infrastructure that you have. And with that, you're of course going to want to have other development teams, other accounts within your AWS organization, deploy resources onto the Outpost. And to do that, we use AWS Resource Access Manager. And Resource Access Manager, or RAM for short, RAM lets you take those Outpost resources that exist within that account, and it lets you share them out with other organizational units or other accounts within your AWS organization. And so if you want to share it with a specific OU within your dev and test or prod account structures, or just share specific resources with individual accounts, you can do that with AWS Resource Access Manager.
And then on the right side here, we have a short list of services and tools you can use on Outpost and in an AWS region to monitor and manage your capacity. In effect, though, it really takes us through our agenda today. We're going to walk through using the Outpost console. We're going to show you how to monitor your Outpost capacity using CloudWatch. Chris will build a dashboard that we think is super useful. We'll use Resource Access Manager along with EC2 capacity reservations to show how you can enforce limits on how much capacity different accounts can access when you are sharing that out. And then we'll wrap up with managing placement and where instances land on your Outpost using placement groups. And then this last one here, cost and usage reports, are super useful. We won't cover it today, but it's something that kind of helps you after the fact. But still very useful in doing chargebacks within organizations and kind of determining who used what. So with that, let's get started with monitoring.
Absolutely. So when it comes to monitoring Outposts, there are some native monitoring functionality built within the Outpost console. We'll show you that in just a moment in the demo. But really to let you customize what you want to see and enabling you to produce the visuals that you want to monitor as you monitor your Outpost capacity, that's really where Amazon CloudWatch shines. So to show you the CloudWatch metrics that are available, and this is above and beyond the standard EC2 and other service CloudWatch metrics that the services themselves provide. These CloudWatch metrics enable you to monitor essentially those three dimensions that we talked about that you've used to size your Outpost. So you can, for example, use these metrics to monitor the EC2 compute resources that are being consumed on the Outpost, the EBS block storage, and the S3 on Outpost object storage. And these metrics are exposed underneath the AWS Outposts CloudWatch namespace and underneath the AWS S3 Outposts CloudWatch namespace. And rather than just talk to you about metrics, we're going to demo this and show you how to create these dashboards and use these metrics. In this demo, I'm going to walk you through the default monitoring and visibility provided by the Outpost console. I'll show you the CloudWatch namespaces and metrics that you can use to monitor your Outpost, and how to create custom CloudWatch dashboards to provide quick insights into your Outpost capacity. Let's switch over to the AWS console. So if we come into the AWS console and go to AWS Outposts, we'll see that I've got an outpost registered to my account. I can see its anchor availability zone. This specific outpost is anchored to US West 2A. And if we bring it up, we'll see that we've got several tabs that can provide us details about the outpost, as well as give us some initial capacity monitoring abilities for watching our EC2 capacity, our S3 capacity, and EBS. We can also look at resource shares that we've created to share the Outpost resources with other accounts in our AWS organization. Let's take a look at our EC2 capacity. So right at the top, we can see available EC2 capacity, and we can see the total number of instance capacity exceptions that have happened in the last 72 hours. Now, an instance capacity exception happens when a user makes a request that cannot be fulfilled, well, due to insufficient capacity. And so it's important to monitor these to see and make sure that we're providing the resources to our users that they need. If we come in, we can look and see those instance capacity exceptions looking at a time series. That was the last 72 hours. So if I look at a 3-day chart, I can see when and where those happened and what resources were requested. In this case, it looks like on 10/6, there were 2 instance capacity errors when someone requested a C5 large, and it looks like the same thing on the 7th. We could come in and look at the availability for our Outpost and see what percentage of our capacity for each of our instance families or each of our instance types. We can come in and see what percentage of those resources are available. Again, we can look at that over time, be that anywhere from 1 hour to 1 week on the chart, as well as looking at the utilization. And so this is showing us how much of those resources are being used at any one point in time. Now, these percentages, or these charts, I should say, show you percentages. So they show you what percent of the Outpost capacity is either available or is being used. And that's great to give you a quick visualization and trend for what your capacity of your Outpost looks like. But you may want to dig into more detail. And so we'll do that in CloudWatch. Now, before we hop to CloudWatch, just to show you really quickly, we also get quick snapshot views for our available S3 capacity, as well as EBS. But we want to dive a little deeper, so we're going to switch over to CloudWatch. Now in CloudWatch, we're going to go on the left-hand side and click on Dashboards, and we're going to create a new dashboard. It prompts us to add our first widget to the dashboard. And what I'd like to see just at a quick glance is, let's say, those percentages. I'd like to see how much of each of my instance families capacity is being used at any one point in time. So I'll select a number widget, and we can see the available namespaces that we can pull metrics from. And we looked earlier that our Outpost metrics are available under AWS, the Outpost namespace, and our S3 on Outpost metrics are available under S3 Outposts. But in this case, we're looking for our EC2 instance family metrics. So we'll look on the Outposts, and we'll look at by Outpost and instance family. Now, what I'd really like to see is how much of our capacity we're utilizing. So I want to look at instance family capacity utilization. And since I've got a lot of different metrics mixed in here, I can actually click on this little arrow and say add to search, which will narrow it down. And then I can check the specific metrics that I want to add to my chart. I'm kind of obsessive compulsive. I like to see things in a certain order, so I can click them in the order that I want them. I'd like to see my C5, my C5D, my M5, my M5D, R5, R5D, I3EN, and G4DN instance families. And so we can see what my widget's going to look like. We can see the percentages of each of these instance families and how much of them is being used at any given point in time, or at least this period right now is looking at the last 5 minutes. And so we can come in and we'll give this widget a name, just call it EC2, and we'll create widget to add this to my dashboard. So just with this simple widget, I can come in and see my instance family utilization across all my families for a given outpost. But I can see that I've got a fair percentage of my G4DN instances being used. So let's drill into that just a little bit. As well as, in addition to numbers, I might like to visualize some of these resources. So let's come in and add a pie chart so we can visualize that utilization. We'll click metrics. Again, we'll go back to outposts. So let's look at our instance family utilization. And I want G4DN And I'd like to look at how much of our capacity I'm using versus how much is available. I'm going to change these names to be a little friendlier. So instead of saying instance family capacity utilization, I'm just going to say, hey, this is my used capacity, and this is my available capacity. And we'll say this is my G4DN. And so if we add this, create this widget, I get a nice pie chart that lets me see that 46.2% of my utilization that I'm using. And I'd like to drill into that a little further and see very specifically what instances are running and which ones are available. So we'll add just a couple more widgets. Number, we'll go back to outposts. And this time we're going to do this by outpost and instance type. Again, I'm interested in my G4DN. And this time I would like to see, let's start with looking at the instances I'm using. So let's do used instance type count. So I want to count how many of my used instances by type are being used. Filter this, and I want to see my extra larges, my 2 extra larges, 4 extra larges, and 8 extra larges. And we'll say this is G4DN instances. So these are my running instances. We'll add this widget. And let's also take a look. I'm going to shrink that down just a little bit. And now that I know how many are running, let's look and see how many are available. So we'll do a very similar widget, only this time we'll go to outposts, get instance types, and this time I want available instance type count. And also for my, again, we want to look at our extra larges, our 2 extra larges, 4 extra large, and 8 extra large. And we'll call this G4DN available. Create widget. We'll shrink it down. We'll put it alongside our other widget here. And so very quickly, I get a view where I can come in and see, for a given family, in this case, my G4DN instance family, I can see what percentage is being used, what percentage is available. I can come in and get a very specific view of how many of those instances and which sizes are being used. So in this case, you can see we're running 1 2 extra large instance, 2 4 extra large instances, and 1 8 extra large. I also note that I have a number available. So I've got 7 extra larges that aren't being used. I've got 3 2XLs, 2 4XLs. And I note that I have 0 8 extra larges available. If that was a concern to me, or if I wanted to be able to be notified anytime that I had an instance pool that had no available instances, I could come in and create a CloudWatch alarm. We're not going to walk through that right now, but it's easy enough to create an alarm and say, hey, I want to monitor this metric, and you specify a threshold saying when it's above or below this threshold, send me a notification. Now, this dashboard that we're creating, this is all for one specific outpost. And so you can certainly come in and create dashboards for each outpost with the metrics and the instance families and sizes that you're interested in for that specific outpost deployment. You could also create a dashboard that spans multiple outposts and shows you kind of a high-level visualization. The nice thing about CloudWatch dashboards is it lets you create and visualize the metrics that you're specifically interested in and use them as you need. Now let's take a look at another dashboard. And actually, before we do that, we'll save this dashboard. Let's take a look at one that Jennifer's created. In this case, she's visualizing for an outpost the C5, M5, and R5 instance families. So we can very quickly get a heads up and see that, hey, we're using almost 12% of our C5 resources, 6% of our M5, and 2% of our R5 resources, and quickly see what instance sizes are available to us to deploy additional resources. So this could be very useful for your application teams if they need to spin up some test or dev resources or production workloads on outposts. They can come in and very quickly get a view for what the capacity looks like, what instance sizes are available that they can deploy their workloads on. So very useful. And one thing I want to show you is how you can use these dashboards. So you can, of course, you can share them. So you can create public URLs or share them with specific users. If you share a public, or if you create a public URL, it's available only to those people who have the URL. If you need to lock it down further, like I said, you can share it with specific users. So you can share the dashboard out. You can favorite it. I like Jennifer's dashboard. We'll go ahead and favorite it. You can also view and edit the source. Now, I don't think that you guys will create or really probably edit your dashboards by editing the JSON, but I will tell you how this can be really useful. So if you create a dashboard like what Jennifer's created for one outpost, and let's say you have several outposts, and you want to recreate the same dashboard for another outpost. A really easy way to do that, rather than clicking and dragging and adjusting and creating it manually for each outpost, is to come in and go to this edit and view source. You can copy the source, open it up in your favorite text editor, and then just replace the Outpost ID. So if you just wanted to see the exact same charts, if they had the same instance family pools, you just wanted to duplicate this dashboard and just swap out which outpost it's pointed to, it's really easy to do by just editing this in a text editor and swapping out the Outpost ID. If your other outpost is anchored to a separate region, you may need to also adjust the region. But again, a quick edit, replace in a text file, go create a new dashboard, go to view, edit source, paste in the code, and you can very quickly and easily duplicate your dashboards looking at different outposts. Now, when you do this, the last thing I'm going to show you, because this becomes very helpful to some customers, is you can come in, you can pull up this dashboard. Perhaps you created one of those shared URLs, and you can put it up full screen. And so this works very well if you want to put it up in a wall board, in your data center. You can come in and have a nice display sitting right next to your outpost that shows the present utilization. And that way you get quick visualizations, quick insights into this is what my outpost utilization looks like. All right, so in this demo, I've shown you a few things. I showed you the default monitoring and visibility provided by the Outpost console. I showed you the CloudWatch namespaces and metrics you can use to monitor your outposts, and how to create custom CloudWatch dashboards to provide quick insights into your outpost capacity. So Jennifer, now that we've looked at how to use and monitor outpost utilization using Amazon CloudWatch, how about we take a look at how we can manage that outpost utilization with EC2 capacity reservations?
Absolutely. So this part is it's partly about a feature called EC2 capacity reservations, but it's also in part about sharing using Resource Access Manager. And I'll stop and point out again, these are the same tools that you use for reservations and sharing in an AWS region. And one great benefit, though, is that while these are charged for in the region, on an outpost, you've pre-purchased that capacity. So there's no weighing the benefits of whether it's worth doing a reservation. If you need a reservation, just set one up. So on this first slide, I'll let you know that we're seeing capacity reservations be used in two main ways. One is if you know you have a workload that needs to auto scale or grow to meet demand, or maybe you want to keep capacity around in case of a failover or an impacting event, and you want to make sure that no other workload is encroaching on that capacity that you're going to need. The other situation is when you're using RAM and you have a lot of distinct users on the outpost, all doing different things. Maybe monitoring, like we just looked at, is sufficient for your organization or group, but some customers really want to put limits effectively in place to ensure that everyone is getting their fair share. So one way to do this that we kind of lay out on this next slide is for the outpost owner to create capacity reservations for the majority of the outpost capacity. And that's shown in this diagram as the orange, blue, and green pools. The blue and green pools have been shared using Resource Access Manager with Business Unit A and Business Unit B. And then the orange pool, or the attic, as it's labeled here, is only available to the outpost owner. And it could be shared out to the business units at any time in the future. Then there's also this bulk pool with the red outline, and that represents the unreserved capacity on the outposts. And because it's unreserved, it's available to any account or organizational unit that you share the outpost with. And the idea is that this gives each business unit a working capacity. It also gives them a little bit of spillover in the case of the bulk pool. And I'll mention that's nice to have in the case of services that don't interact with capacity reservations like RDS or ALB. And then as you need to increase those pools, you can do so from that owner attic pool. So you can release reservations and put them back into the bulk pool, or you can share them directly to the business units. So with that, let's jump into a quick demo of how to create and share capacity reservations on the Outpost. So starting in the AWS Management Console, when I'm creating resources in the console that I want to make sure land on the Outpost, you can always specify the subnet that's on the Outpost and the resource will land there. But I just like to go through the Outpost console here. It has a nice benefit of pre-selecting some things so that you have a little bit more confidence of where that resource is going to be. So I have an outpost here, and I'm going to use this action menu to create a capacity reservation. And I'm going to select C5.large. I know I have quite a few of those. You can see here that the outpost ARN is pre-selected, which is great. And you can select a quantity. Let's throw 12 into this one. Why not? Reservation details, the thing I'll call out here is that this is the same capacity reservations that you're using in the region. So same as region, you can select when that reservation ends, whether you want it to expire at a certain time or if you would actually go in and cancel it yourself. You can also select, and this is really important, when instances will be launched into this capacity reservation. Is it that the capacity reservation will accept any instance launch by anyone who has access to the capacity reservation, or is it that you only want instances to launch into the capacity reservation when you specifically call out that reservation ID? So we're going to leave this one open. Not a lot of people on my outpost, so I think I'm pretty confident there. And so you can see this capacity reservation here that I just created. You can also see that it is existing on the outpost itself. From here, I can actually launch an instance, and maybe we'll jump in there just to show you how you can specify that capacity reservation ID. I'll jump down here and select my instance type. I'll select my VPC, and then when you get to capacity reservation, you can either leave it open, and for any capacity reservation that matches the instance type that you're about to create, it will be utilized, or you can select this target by ID, and you can select the capacity reservation we just created, and then launch that. From here, I'm going to actually jump out and go completely different direction to this resource access manager. This is how we manage sharing resources across accounts in the AWS region. I'll show you how we would share a capacity reservation similar to the scenario I just talked about. So I have an existing resource share here. I'm going to select that and just look at what we've got going on. We have a COIT pool, we have the local gateway route table, the S3, and the outpost itself. I've already got one capacity reservation shared here. And then looking at who it's shared with, it's an entire organizational unit that I have identified here. So I'm going to go ahead and use this same one and just modify it and add the capacity reservation I just created. So you can see I have two here. I'll select this additional one that I just created. Confirm that I want to give all the permissions associated there. And then you can see that I'll select the same organizational unit, which is a subset of my organization, a grouping of accounts. Confirm one more time, this is what I want to do, and I'll update my resource share. So creating those capacity reservations and allowing them to be shared across different accounts is not only easy, it's also really flexible. You can set up individual instances or large groups of them. You can keep them for a single account or workload, or you can share them out to individuals and groups of accounts. There's just a lot of flexibility provided in that EC2 feature. And again, some creative ways that people are using them on the outposts. Another thing that comes up when we're talking about capacity management on the outpost is placement. And what I mean by placement is where physically is the instance that I'm launching going to land? And that's something that in an on-prem enterprise world, you'd be very aware of. In the cloud, though, it's totally abstracted. And we use this concept called placement groups so that you can tell us your goals and we can place your instances in physical locations that will achieve those goals. And that's important sometimes in the region, not for all use cases, but on the outpost, because of the limited capacity, it does become pretty important. So just a quick intro of how this EC2 feature works in the region. On the next slide here, we have 3 placement strategies available to you. The first one is spread. So this is great for when you have a set of instances that should not be running on the same physical hardware. And what we do here is we spread it across distinct racks. On an outpost, I'll go ahead and note that you can always add an additional rack to your SKU, even if it's not necessary for the amount of capacity that you're purchasing. And when you're planning for N+1 or N+M, that's a great level of security that you're giving yourself. The next one, I'll jump down to cluster. So this is great for when you have a bunch of instances that are talking to each other. And in the region, we cluster these so that they're all within or connected to the same network spine. And on an outpost, the equivalent of that would be an ACE rack deployment. We generally recommend when you have more than 3 racks in your outpost deployment that you add an ACE rack to that order. And so this helps those clustered instances talk to each other much more cohesively. And then the third one that I think is really most useful is kind of a combination of the two. So you're clustering instances and then spreading those clusters across racks. In the region, each partition is at a minimum 1 rack, and then it might spread across multiple racks. So this one is really useful for when you have instances that relate to each other, but then you have redundant sets of those, either for failover or load balancing purposes, and you want them to be physically separated as much as possible. And then I'll show you in the console in a minute here, but I like to look at the command line sometimes because it just informs me of what's really necessary in order to make this happen. You can see for creating a placement group and launching an instance, there's really nothing unique for the Outpost environment. You create the group, give it a name and a strategy, you create the instance, you call out the subnet that's located on the Outpost, and then you specify which placement group you want to use. The other interesting thing here is for the partition strategy, you have the option of auto placement, where you can specify the placement group, but you don't tell it which partition to go to. Or, like is just demonstrated on the last line here, you can specify the exact partition you want it to go to. And I have a feeling for those of you who are keen to implement placement groups on your outposts that you'll want this level of control, because unless you have a fairly large outpost deployment, this is effectively letting you specify a rack for your instance to land on. And let's take a look now at the EC2 placement groups demo. We'll show you how to create those placement groups and what happens when you don't have enough capacity on the outpost for that placement group. So again, starting from the AWS Management Console, I'm going to go back to the Outpost console for those nice shortcuts. I'll launch an instance from this menu. Select the AMI. And you can see here, this coming from this view actually limits the instance types that are shown as to only the ones that are available on this outpost. So I'll select that instance type, C5 large again, and select my VPC. The placement group creation can be done from the EC2 menu, and I'll show you that separately, but it can also be done inline right here with the launch instances workflow. I'll just check this checkbox and create a new placement group. We'll try out the spread strategy first, so I'll call this one rack spread. And remember, you have no control over the spread strategy, over which specific rack the instance is going to be placed onto. And you'll see this outpost that I'm working with actually has 2 racks. So I'm going to launch 2 instances there, and then when I go back and try to launch a third, I'll get a error, insufficient capacity error. So I've got my 2 in my spread placement group. You can see those 2. I'll name them here so we can come back later. Spread 1, spread 2. And then let's go back to the Outpost console and try to launch one more, which we know is going to fail, but we're going to try it anyways. This time I'll select existing placement group and select that rack spread group that I created before. It's nice that it updates here with the amount of instances I have left. But I'll go ahead and try to launch this, and you'll see I'm going to get a failure here on initiating the launch because I don't have enough capacity on the Outpost because I only have 2 racks and we tried to launch 3 into the spread placement group. Next, we're going to take a look at the partition strategy. So I'll go back and start this again. I imagine people using this partition strategy for multi-tier apps where you want your front end and your back end to be on the same rack for latency, but maybe you want a redundant set to be on a different rack for HA. And when you go through and select the partition placement group here, you get a few extra options. I'm only going to add 2 partitions here because I know I only have 2 racks. If I added more, it's not going to work. If I had, let's say, a really large outpost and I had 8 racks, like we talked about before, the minimum of a partition is a rack, but the maximum partitions in a partition placement group is 7. So if you did have 8 racks, one of these partitions would be spread across 2 racks if you needed it. So I'll select 2 here, and I'll go ahead and say I want to target this at the second partition. You can also choose auto distribution here, so it just kind of spreads them across, so you don't have to have that control. But I would imagine that if you're going to the trouble of setting up these partition placement groups, that you are going to want to have that level of control. So this is really allowing you to place things with greater granularity than you really ever have been able to before on an outpost. We'll just take a look at a few of the details here before ending this demo. When I look at the details of these instances, one, you can verify that they're running on the outpost. You can see the placement group here is rack spread. And you can look in networking here to see the outpost ID. And then if I want to look at the partition one that I created, the same thing, outpost ID is available in the networking tab. And you can see a little more information under placement groups where we have the placement group name as well as the partition that is existing on. You can verify all of that information here. And really it's most interesting to me because you can see the actual rack that your instances has been launched onto. Really useful for a lot of people.
So thanks, Jennifer, for that awesome demo. It's great to see how we can use EC2 placement groups to control where our instances land on Outpost. It becomes super important when we're planning for high availability and ensuring that our workloads run where we want them to, isolating failures. It's just an awesome bit of functionality. And it's nice that it works on premises just like it does in the cloud. Okay, so as next steps, for all of you who have gotten a bit of education from the session today, what are we going to go forward and do? So we've provided these additional resources on the right-hand side where we've got links to more information on each of these topics, each of these features. You can dive in, review that information, and begin using the functionality. We will make sure that you get copies of the slides so that you can actually use these links. The presentation will be attached with the recording of the session. So even if you're viewing this after the fact, you should be able to access this information. Now, if you don't have an Outpost deployment today, you can talk with your AWS account team. We are glad to work with you. We can help you plan your Outpost capacity by sizing your compute, your block storage, and your object storage requirements. We'll either use a standard SKU if it fits your needs or put together a custom configuration for you so that you get exactly what you need, the pool of compute and storage and networking that you need in your on-premises environment so you can start running AWS services within your facilities. And then once you've got your Outpost, or if you already are an Outpost customer, you can, of course, start monitoring, managing, and controlling your capacity using Amazon CloudWatch, EC2 capacity reservations, and EC2 placement groups, just like we've shown you today. So with that, I think we're going to dive into some Q&A. I know we've been addressing questions in the chat live through the session, but if there's some questions that we want to do right now and take verbally, we'll do it at this time.